The pen felt heavier than it should have as I watched Marcus scrawl his signature across the divorce papers. His mouth twisted in that familiar smirk that had once charmed me into believing I'd found my soulmate. The sound that escaped him wasn't quite a chuckle, but it wasn't quiet either. A low, satisfied rumble that seemed to echo off the sterile walls of the lawyer's office. Finally, he said, not bothering to look at me as he slid the papers across the mahogany table. I'm free, free. The word hung in the air like smoke, acrid and suffocating. Free from what exactly? From the woman who had worked 2 jobs to put him through law school? From the wife who had sacrificed her own dreams to build his? From the partner who had believed every lie, every excuse, every promise that things would get better once his career took off? I picked up the pen with steady hands, though inside, everything was crumbling. 23 years of marriage, reduced to signatures on legal documents. 23 years of believing that love could survive anything, even the gradual erosion of respect, intimacy, and basic human decency. You know what the best part is, Emma? Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expensive suit immaculate, his silver hair perfectly styled. At 52, he looked every inch the successful attorney he'd become, the attorney I'd helped create. I don't have to pretend anymore. No more, yes, dear, and you're right, honey. No more acting like your little art projects matter. My little art projects. 3 gallery showings, dozens of commissioned pieces, and a growing reputation in the local art community, all dismissed with 4 casual words. I felt something cold settle in my chest. Not quite anger, not quite hurt. Something cleaner, clearer. The house is mine, obviously, he continued, sliding a folder toward me. My name's on the deed. The car, the boat, the cabin in Aspen, all mine. You'll get the settlement we discussed. Should be enough for a nice little apartment somewhere. Maybe you can paint portraits of people's pets for extra cash. His lawyer, a sharp-faced woman named Patricia Welch, cleared her throat uncomfortably. Even she seemed disturbed by Marcus's cruelty, though she'd been instrumental in crafting the divorce settlement that left me with almost nothing. In the no-fault divorce state where we lived, and with Marcus's superior legal knowledge and connections, I'd been outmaneuvered at every turn. The settlement is quite generous considering the circumstances, Patricia said, though her tone suggested she didn't entirely believe her own words. Mrs. Hartwell will receive $40,000 and— It's fine, I interrupted, signing my name with the same steady hand I used to paint. I accept the terms. Marcus's laugh was louder this time, genuine amusement dancing in his eyes. Smart girl. You always did know when you were beat. He stood, straightening his tie. Patricia will handle the rest of the paperwork. I have a dinner reservation at 8. A dinner reservation. Not with me, obviously, with her. The associate at his firm, 15 years younger, with long legs and an MBA, and no complicated history of sacrifice and shared dreams. Veronica something or other. I'd known about her for months before Marcus had bothered to tell me, and even then, he'd framed it as though it were my fault. If you'd taken better care of yourself, he'd said during one of our final fights. If you'd been more interesting, more ambitious, maybe things would have been different. More ambitious. From the man whose ambition I'd funded with my inheritance, my mother's life insurance money, my own dreams of art school deferred and eventually abandoned. But I didn't say any of that. I'd learned over the years that Marcus never heard anything that contradicted his carefully constructed narrative of himself as the wronged party. Goodbye, Marcus, I said as he headed for the door. He paused, turned back with that same cruel smile. You know what I'm looking forward to most? Not having to explain you to people anymore. My colleagues, clients, they never understood what I was doing with someone so ordinary. Now I can finally be with someone who matches my success. The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving me alone with Patricia and the scattered papers that had just dissolved my marriage. I felt strangely calm, as though I were floating slightly above my body, watching this happen to someone else. Mrs. Hartwell, Patricia said softly, I want you to know that this wasn't personal for me. I was just doing my job. I understand, I said, and I meant it. Marcus had orchestrated this entire thing, choosing his colleague as my representation, knowing she'd be more loyal to him than to me. It was brilliant, really. Ruthless, but brilliant. I gathered my purse and the few documents that were actually mine, including the settlement check that would have to last me, Well, for as long as I could make it last. $40,000 wasn't nothing, but it wasn't much of a foundation for rebuilding a life at 50. The parking lot was nearly empty, just my 15-year-old Honda and Patricia's sleek BMW. As I fumbled for my keys, I heard Marcus's voice from across the lot, already on his phone. "It's done," he was saying, his voice carrying easily in the evening air. "She took the settlement like a lamb, didn't even fight." A pause, then that laugh again. "I know, I know. I should have done this years ago. You're right, baby. She was holding me back from the beginning." I sat in my car for a long moment after he drove away, not crying, not screaming, just breathing. The woman in Marcus's passenger seat had been young and beautiful, just as I'd expected. They looked happy together, or at least excited about their future. Their future that was built in part on the rubble of mine. But as I drove away from that lawyer's office, away from the official end of my marriage, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Possibility. For the first time in decades, I had no one to answer to, no one to manage or enable or sacrifice for. The terrifying freedom of starting over at 50 with almost nothing was also, somehow, liberating. The apartment I found was tiny, a studio in an older building downtown, but it had huge windows that faced east and caught the morning light beautifully. At $600 a month, it would give me time to figure out what came next. I bought a futon, a small table, and art supplies. Real art supplies. Not the bargain brushes and student-grade paints I'd been making do with for years. For the first time since I was 25, I painted every day. Not little watercolors of flowers for the local craft fair, but real work. Bold, emotional pieces that came from someplace I'd almost forgotten existed. I painted my anger and my grief and my fear, but also my hope and my determination, and my slowly returning sense of self. The art community I'd been peripherally involved with welcomed me with open arms. Without Marcus's subtle discouragement, his eye rolls when I mentioned shows, his scheduling conflicts whenever I had openings, I began to participate more fully. I joined critique groups, attended workshops, made friends who understood the language of color and composition and creative vision. "Your work has such power now," said Janet Morrison, an established painter who'd become something of a mentor. "There's a rawness to it that wasn't there before." What changed? I thought about her question as I worked on a large canvas, a swirling mass of blues and grays that somehow managed to be both turbulent and peaceful. "I stopped caring what anyone else thought," I said finally. "I stopped trying to make my art fit into someone else's idea of what it should be." 3 months after the divorce was finalized, I had my first real gallery show. Not at the community center or the local coffee shop, but at Meridian Gallery, one of the most respected spaces in the city. The owner, David Chen, had seen my work at a group show and asked to see more. When I'd shown him the pieces I'd been working on since the divorce, he'd gone quiet for a long time. "These are extraordinary," he'd said finally. "They're full of pain, but also strength. They tell a story without being literal. This is the kind of work that changes people." The opening night was everything I'd ever dreamed of. The gallery was packed. Red dots appeared next to my paintings steadily throughout the evening, and people talked about my work with the kind of intensity that every artist hopes for. I sold 12 pieces that night, more than I'd sold in the previous 5 years combined. But the real validation came from an unexpected source. Sarah Hendricks, the art critic for the city's major newspaper, approached me near the end of the evening. "Ms. Hartwell," she said, "I wanted to let you know that I'll be reviewing this show for Sunday's paper. I've been covering art in this city for 15 years, and I can honestly say that this is some of the most compelling work I've seen in a very long time. There's something in these paintings that speaks to universal experiences of loss and resilience. They're going to make waves." The review, when it appeared, was everything Sarah had promised and more. She wrote about the fierce honesty of my work, the way it transforms personal pain into something transcendent. The review was picked up by regional art publications, then by a national magazine that specialized in emerging artists. Within 6 months, I had gallery representation in 3 cities and a waiting list of collectors wanting to commission pieces. My tiny studio apartment became impossible to work in, so I rented a proper studio space in the Arts District. For the first time in my adult life, I was making real money from my art. more money than I'd ever made at anything. It was around this time that I ran into Marcus. I was coming out of an upscale art supply store, my arms full of canvases and premium paints, when I heard someone call my name. I turned to see him approaching, looking exactly as polished and confident as ever, though there was something different in his expression. Uncertainty, maybe, or confusion. "Emma," he said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes, "you look different." I supposed I did. I'd lost weight without trying, my skin had cleared up from the stress-related breakouts that had plagued me during the final years of our marriage, and I'd started dressing like the successful artist I was becoming instead of trying to be invisible. I felt different too, stronger, more myself than I'd been in decades. "Hello, Marcus," I said pleasantly. "How are you?" "Good, good. Great, actually." He gestured vaguely down the street. "Just finished up with a client. Big case, might make the papers." He paused, clearly fishing for me to ask about it. When I didn't, he continued. "I heard you had some kind of art show recently." "I did. It went well." Another pause. I could see him struggling with something, the way he used to when he wanted to ask for money, but didn't want to admit he needed it. "Veronica mentioned she saw the review in the paper, said it was complimentary." Complimentary, the review that had called my work breathtaking and essential viewing, had been, in Marcus's assessment, complimentary. "That's nice of her to mention," I said. "I should get going. These canvases are heavy." "Emma, wait." He reached out as if to touch my arm, then seemed to think better of it. I wanted to. I've been thinking that maybe we were too hasty. With the divorce. Maybe we could have worked things out. For a moment, I couldn't quite process what he was saying. The man who had laughed while signing our divorce papers, who had told me I was holding him back, who had humiliated me in front of lawyers and friends and anyone who would listen, was now suggesting we might have been hasty. "Marcus," I said gently, "you're married to Veronica now." His face flushed slightly. "Well, yes, but that was... we were both emotional, making decisions. I just think if we'd had time to cool off." I studied his face, trying to understand what had prompted this sudden revisionist history. Then it hit me. He'd heard about my success, maybe seen the prices my paintings were commanding, and was wondering if he'd made a mistake. Not emotionally, I didn't think Marcus was capable of that kind of self-reflection, but financially. "I have to go," I said. "Take care of yourself." This time, I walked away before he could respond, leaving him standing on the sidewalk with that confused expression still on his face. I felt a moment of something that might have been pity, but it passed quickly. I had work to do. The work consumed me in the best possible way. I was painting larger pieces now, installations that took weeks to complete. Museums were starting to take notice. I had a solo show coming up at the Modern Art Institute, a career-making opportunity that would have been unthinkable 2 years earlier. I was putting the finishing touches on the centerpiece of that show, a massive triptych about transformation and rebirth, when my phone rang. It was Janet Morrison, and she sounded excited. "Emma, are you sitting down? Because you might want to be sitting down for this." "What's going on?" "I just got a call from Rebecca Shaw at the National Endowment for the Arts. You know the MacArthur Fellowship? The Genius Grants?" I did know about them. Prestigious awards given to artists, writers, and thinkers whose work showed exceptional creativity and potential for important future contribution. They came with recognition that could transform careers and a substantial monetary award. "Emma, you're on the short list. They want to interview you next week." I sat down hard on my studio stool, nearly knocking over a jar of brushes. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure. Rebecca said your work has been on their radar since the newspaper review, and the buzz from your recent shows pushed you into serious consideration. She called your pieces transformative and said they represent exactly the kind of artistic vision the fellowship is meant to support." The interview process was rigorous, involving not just discussions of my work, but my artistic philosophy, my plans for the future, and my thoughts on the role of art in society. I found myself talking about resilience, about the way trauma could be transformed into something beautiful and meaningful, about the importance of authenticity in a world that often rewarded superficiality. 2 weeks later, Rebecca Shaw called personally to tell me I'd been selected. The MacArthur Fellowship came with $875,000, paid out over 5 years, and recognition as one of the most promising artists in the country. I was going to be profiled in magazines, featured in documentaries, invited to speak at conferences and universities. The news broke on a Tuesday morning. By Tuesday afternoon, my phone was ringing constantly. Journalists wanting interviews, galleries wanting to represent me, collectors wanting to buy pieces. I turned my phone off and went to my studio, needing the quiet to process what had just happened to my life. I was cleaning brushes when I heard someone knocking on the studio door. I'd given strict instructions to the building manager not to let anyone up without calling first, so I approached the door cautiously. Emma? Emma, I know you're in there. Please open the door. Marcus, of course. I considered ignoring him, but something in his voice, a note of desperation I'd never heard before, made me turn the lock. He looked terrible. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his tie askew, his face flushed and sweaty despite the cool October air. Behind him stood Veronica, looking equally distressed but trying to maintain some semblance of dignity. Congratulations, Marcus said, though the words seemed to stick in his throat. The MacArthur Fellowship. That's incredible. Thank you. I didn't invite them in, just stood in the doorway waiting to see what they wanted. I had to come, he continued, running a hand through his hair. I had to tell you how proud I am. How proud I've always been of your talent. You know I always supported your art, always believed in you. The revisionist history was breathtaking in its audacity. This was the man who had called my work little art projects, who had scheduled important dinners on the nights of my shows, who had made me feel foolish for believing I had any talent at all. Marcus, I said quietly, why are you here? For a moment, his careful composure cracked, and I saw something raw and desperate underneath. I made a mistake, Emma. A terrible mistake. We should have worked harder, tried counseling, anything but divorce. I threw away 23 years for nothing. Veronica shifted uncomfortably behind him. Marcus, we talked about this. No, he said, not taking his eyes off me. We can't pretend anymore. You see what she's accomplished? What she was capable of all along? I was an idiot to let her go. Let me go. As if I were a stock he'd sold too early. A business opportunity he'd failed to recognize. As if my worth was determined by my net worth. My value contingent on my success. I want you back, he said. And now his voice was breaking. I know I have no right to ask. I know I hurt you. But I want to try again. We could be partners, real partners this time. I could help you manage your career, handle the business side of things. We could be a team. A team. Now that I was successful, now that I had something he wanted to be associated with, we could be a team. I thought about the years I'd spent believing I needed him, thinking his approval mattered, measuring my worth by his standards. Emma, he continued, when I didn't respond, I know the settlement wasn't fair. I know I didn't appreciate what you contributed to my success. I can make that right. We can make this right. How? I asked, genuinely curious about his answer. We could remarry. I'd sign a prenup protecting your assets, your career. I wouldn't interfere with your art. I've learned from my mistakes. Behind him, Veronica was crying now, quiet tears that she was trying to hide. I felt sorry for her, this young woman who had thought she was winning a prize, only to discover that her husband was willing to abandon her the moment something better came along. Marcus, I said, I think you should go home to your wife. But Emma? Go home, I repeated, more firmly this time. Veronica deserves better than this. And so do I. I closed the door before he could respond, turned the lock, and leaned against the heavy wood. Through the door, I could hear muffled voices, Veronica's angry sobs, Marcus's increasingly desperate pleas. Eventually, the voices faded, and I heard footsteps retreating down the hallway. I turned back to my work, the triptych that had consumed me for months. The 3 panels told a story of destruction, transformation, and rebirth. In the first panel, a figure was breaking apart, dissolving into fragments of color and light. In the second, those fragments swirled in chaos, dark and turbulent, but shot through with gold. In the third, the fragments had reformed into something new, still recognizably human, but more powerful, more complete than before. Looking at it now, I realized I'd been painting my own story without fully understanding it. The woman who had signed those divorce papers 2 years ago was gone, dissolved into fragments. The woman who stood here now was built from those same pieces, but arranged differently, strengthened by the breaking and the healing. My phone buzzed with a text message. Janet Morrison. Saw the news vans outside your building. You okay? News vans. Of course. The story of the recently divorced woman who had transformed heartbreak into artistic triumph was exactly the kind of narrative the media loved. I suspected it would be told and retold in profiles and interviews, possibly optioned for movies. The abandoned wife's journey to MacArthur Fellowship was a modern fairy tale, complete with a villain and a happy ending. But that wasn't quite right, I realized. Marcus wasn't a villain exactly. He was a man who had made choices based on his own fears and limitations, who had measured worth in all the wrong ways, who had confused possession with love and control with partnership. He was small, ultimately, smaller than I'd ever realized when I was making myself smaller to fit into his world. And this wasn't really a happy ending, because ending suggested completion, finality. What I had found wasn't an ending, but a beginning. At 52, I was just discovering who I could be when I stopped trying to be who someone else needed me to be. The fellowship money would give me freedom to experiment, to take risks, to create work that mattered. I had plans, big, ambitious plans that would have terrified the woman I used to be. I wanted to travel, to study different artistic traditions, to push the boundaries of my own capabilities. I wanted to mentor other artists who had been told their work didn't matter, their dreams weren't practical, their voices weren't worth hearing. But first, I wanted to finish this painting. I picked up my brush, loaded it with gold paint, and added one final touch to the third panel, a small detail that transformed the entire piece. The reborn figure wasn't just stronger than before, she was luminous, radiating light that illuminated everything around her. As I worked, I thought about karma, about justice, about the strange way the universe sometimes corrects its own imbalance. Marcus had gotten exactly what he thought he wanted: freedom from an ordinary wife, marriage to a beautiful younger woman, public validation of his choices. But what he'd really gotten was the opportunity to discover that he'd been measuring the wrong things all along. His laughter on that day 2 years ago had been the laughter of a man who thought he was winning. Today's tears were the tears of a man who finally understood what he had lost, not in dollars or prestige, but in connection, in partnership, in the quiet satisfaction that comes from building something meaningful with another person. I didn't take pleasure in his pain, but I couldn't deny the symmetry of it. The man who had dismissed my worth had been forced to confront my value in terms he could understand. The woman he had deemed ordinary had been recognized as extraordinary by people whose opinions carried weight in the world he cared about. But the real victory wasn't in his recognition or regret. The real victory was in my own transformation, in the discovery that I had never needed his approval to be valuable, his support to be strong, his love to be worthy of love. As the sun set outside my studio windows, painting everything in golden light, I added my signature to the corner of the triptych: Emma Hartwell, 2025. Not the woman I had been, but the woman I had become. The woman I was still becoming. Tomorrow, there would be interviews and photo shoots, gallery visits, and business meetings. There would be decisions to make about exhibitions and commissions, about how to use this platform I'd been given. There would be opportunities I couldn't yet imagine, and challenges I was only beginning to understand. But tonight, there was just this: the satisfaction of work completed, the studio filled with pieces that told my truth, the quiet knowledge that I had survived the breaking and become something stronger in the healing. I had been tested by betrayal and abandonment, and I had emerged not bitter, but luminous, not diminished, but transformed. Marcus had laughed while signing our divorce papers because he thought he was setting himself free. What he had actually done was set me free, free to discover that I had never been ordinary, only constrained, free to learn that my worth had never depended on his recognition, free to become the artist, the woman, the human being I had always been capable of becoming. The karma he had brought upon himself wasn't punishment, exactly, it was simply truth. The truth that real worth can't be measured in the shallow ways he had always used, that authentic success comes from becoming fully yourself, rather than from acquiring the right accessories and achievements. And my reward wasn't revenge or vindication. It was something much more valuable. The knowledge that I was exactly who I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do, finally free to shine with my own light rather than trying to reflect someone else's. As I turned off the studio lights and prepared to go home to my small, perfect apartment, I felt the deep contentment that comes not from having defeated an enemy, but from having defeated the parts of yourself that believed you were not enough. I had signed those divorce papers 2 years ago, thinking I was losing everything. Instead, I had been signing the first page of the best chapter of my life. And that, I thought as I locked the studio door behind me, was the most beautiful kind of justice of all.